Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I'm glad you're spending some time with me today. I appreciate that. Now, according to today's guest, Michael McQueen, who's a global change strategist and, by the way, author of an incredible new book called Mindstuck, Mastering the Art of Changing Minds, well, he says many of us are unknowingly using 20th century techniques for changing 21st century minds, and why this causes people to double down rather than to open up. Today, we'll explore approaches for appealing to the right mind and strategies for disarming people's defenses to make them more open to your influence and your persuasion. All that right here on the Business of Story. As I was reading Mindstuck, and I absolutely loved it, it reminded me of an unintentional social experiment I inadvertently triggered, but in hindsight taught me a ton about social dynamics. And the cause of it was a simple T-shirt. Here's what happened. It was over 20 years ago in 2002. You see, the new president of Washington State University at the time, my beloved alma mater, cringed at the school's legendary nickname that we had all grown up with, which is Wazoo. Now, V. Lane Rollins took the helm of WSU/Wazoo and apparently didn't want to run a major university with the brand story associated with that part of the anatomy. So he decided to ban the brand. Gone were the coffee cups, beer mugs, and T-shirts emblazoned with our proud Wazoo call to arms. That was just nutty, I thought, and I wondered what would Tom Tuttle from Tacoma, Washington do if this travesty was allowed to go down.
Win the day for crimson and gray. Best in the West, we know you'll all do your best. So on, fight till the end. Honor and glory you must win. So fight for Washington State and big. Sorry.
Have you seen John Candy playing Tom Tuttle in the 1985 movie Volunteers? Well, he's a Wazooer if I've ever seen one, belting out our fight song as a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand. I thought, what would Tom do to save Wazoo? So I hatched a plan. The Cougars were playing their first football game that season at CenturyLink Field where the Seahawks play to cozy up to their West Side alumni. The problem was that I was living in Phoenix. So I ordered 500 T-shirts through my pal Jack Hutt, who lived in Seattle, and then I recruited my fellow frat bro Don Bush, his son, and a couple of his friends, also Seattleites, to join my caper and sell the shirts before the game. I figured we'd take a stand to save Wazoo and make a few bucks in the process. Even legendary Seattle madman David Stern, who had retired just north of me here in the desert, got into the game. He let one of his Seattle Times cronies, columnist Jean Godin, in on the story. Here's what she wrote the day before the game. Whither Wazoo? Count Park Howell among the Washington State University alums who were dismayed over WSU President V. Lane Rollins' desire to downplay the school's Wazoo nickname. In April, Rollins said the nickname is derogatory and plays on the perception that WSU is a place where booze trumps books. She continued, Howell, who lives in Phoenix, disagrees, saying, quote, even my Husky buddies can't understand why we'd consider dropping Wazoo. They say, what, you want to be like us? Howell's solution, he's coming to town for tomorrow's game armed with T-shirts that say, I've had political correctness up the Wazoo. I arrived in Seattle that Friday morning, and Don and I went to the stadium, to kind of scope out the best locations to hawk our Wazoo shirts the next day. I said, I'll roll through the tailgaters, you make your way through the incoming fans, and we'll post the boys across the street from the FX McQuarrie's pub. Pleased with our strategy, we retired ourselves to a couple bar stools at a hole in the wall across from the Seahawks stadium, becoming more proud of our plan with every pint. The liquid courage produced another fabulous idea. Hey, let's go and knock on the door of the most popular afternoon drive time radio personalities in town. That would be the Robin and Maynard Show on the classic 102.5 KZOK FM.
The music you grew up with on 102.5 KZOK FM, the classic rock station.
Don said, sounds like a plan. He's a pretty smart dude. You see, Don's a CPA, so he knows how to hedge his bets. He was all in on this gamble with only one foot in the escape hatch just in case. Always admired that about him. So we pulled up to KZOK at the base of Queen Anne Hill in Seattle and explained to the receptionist who we were and what we were up to. Turns out the who we were part didn't much matter, but what we were up to was going to make for some good fodder on the Robin and Maynard Show. In fact, when Maynard heard the overview of our story, he hollered to their producer, directing her to cancel what they had planned for the next 30 minutes. "We're putting these jokers on," he said. Bam! At 4 p.m. sharp, as commuters were backed up on I-90, I-5 and the Evergreen Point Bridge, progressing toward their weekend at the pace of a banana slug, Don and I were blabbing on about our great social cause of saving Wazoo on KZO-K, the rock station we grew up on. It was marvelous. How could President Rollins even consider ditching our beloved Wazoo moniker? We cried with amber ale passion across the airways. We let the listeners know that they could join the cause with their own Up the Wazoo t-shirt before the Coug game for only $15, which was a 200% profit for us. After all activism does require a margin if you're going to be effective, we learned. And finally, we explained since we only had 500 t-shirts to sell, they better find us quick if we didn't find them first. Well, as we left the Robin and Maynard Show, our phones absolutely lit up. Friends and family called saying they had just heard us on the radio. "How did you get in the Robin Maynard Show? I didn't even know you were in town. What in the hell are you up to now, Parks?" What great publicity, I thought. Coverage in the Seattle Times Morning Edition, and now the top afternoon drive time show covering our story. For a once PR guy, turned ad guy, turned business storytelling guy, this was just the publicity we needed to make our statement. Sell our shirts, earn a tidy profit, and enjoy the game on a warm and wonderful fall afternoon. But there was a problem. Our story also reached the Wazoo trademark police. They were onto us, and I hadn't accounted for how much they just might care about our enterprise. So it was game on. The next morning, as Don and I assembled the boys, draped gym bags full of gray cotton t-shirts over their shoulders, furnished them with some small bills for making change, gave them our last bit of t-shirt peddling advice while uttering a few words of caution about thieves, staying hydrated, getting lost and such, she arrived. I don't recall her name, and I should have kept her official business card. And while I guess in hindsight I shouldn't have tossed her cease and desist order, but she caught us red-handed, or crimson for you Cougs out there. She was kind but forceful, telling us that the university had learned about our, quote, little stunt, as she called it, and they own the copyright to Wazoo, and that in no way were we legally able to sell our cute little shirts. We received an ultimatum to pack up and head out, or WSU officials would confiscate our Wazoo loot, or even worse. Then she softened a bit. "Look, I'm a Coug too," she said, "and we're here with our 2 kids and just want to enjoy the game like you. So please stop selling your shirts and let's all have some fun, okay?" I believed her, although I didn't see any hubby on guard in the crowd prepared to intervene should things get ugly. Nor did I see 2 little darling kids leaning into their father's thighs, wondering why mommy was acting all official before a football game. Nonetheless, I assured her that we would stop selling the shirts in front of the stadium and that everything was right in Cougarville. She said thank you, took a couple of steps, paused, and turned. "You mean selling them anywhere, right?" We had already scurried out of earshot, or at least I hoped she would believe that. We made a quick sweep through the maze of motorhomes in the parking lot asking $15 a shirt. We didn't have many takers. Those who did buy had either heard or read about us the day before or simply got the joke about having political correctness up the wazoo and appreciated the effort. But I was sweating because these shirts weren't moving, and I felt like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with the wazoo posse on our tails.
Who are those guys? They're beginning to get on my nerves.
We darted out into the oncoming fan traffic like salmon swimming upstream, hoping to get them to bite. We dropped our price to $10, cutting our margin in half, and we finally started moving some merchandise. Don, his boys, and I finally ended up on the corner across from FX McQuarrie's, a full football field away from the big game. I thought if that copyright cop really had two kids in tow, she probably wouldn't chase us all the way out here to shut us down. I sensed that she felt she had done her job anyway, providing us a stern warning and the cease and desist order. Plus, I kind of think she was on our side. Sales had picked up and we sold around 150 shirts before kickoff. We muled the other 350 shirts back to the car, considered our next steps, and eventually headed into the game. Then the magic happened. We were sitting in the stands with my mom, my brother Chris, and his daughter Elsie, who came for the game and, as it turned out, the show. This lady behind me taps me on my shoulder and points to the Jumbotron screen and said, "Hey, look, they're showing your T-shirt." There it was, splayed across the huge screen right above the scoreboard. Our shirt. Well, it kind of brought a beer to my eye. The buzz had begun. Throughout the game, the cameraman focused on our shirts 3 or 4 times, each time gleaming on the scoreboard video screen. Free pub, man, that's awesome. People stopped us at the concession stand and in the bathroom asking where we got our shirts. If it was happening to us, we figured, then it was happening to lots of others who had already bought their "I've had political correctness up the wazoo" t-shirt. Dawn even ran into Maynard from KZOK-FM in the stadium rocking our shirt. We scrambled out of the stadium before the end of the game, hauled out our merchandise, and started making our way back to our corner. We were intercepted by Coug fans who swarmed us, a little close to the stadium exit for my comfort. They came upon us in 3 ways, and this was where my unwitting social buyer experience unfolded. The first buyer segment I'll call the all-in fan. The all-in fan represented about 50% of our market, or those shirts sold after the game. These were Cougs who had seen the shirt on either a fan or on the Jumbotron and wanted a piece of the action. They came searching for us and often bought 2 or 3 shirts. And once we caught on to their want, we moved our price back up to $15, even $20 per shirt. The second customer segment I called the you-know-you-want-it buyer, which represented about 30% of the market. This guy, and it was always a guy, would walk up, slow down looking at the shirts, pass by debating on whether or not to buy one, and then finally conceding to his desire. We learned that when you spotted one of these guys, all you had to say was, "Come on, you know you want one. You know you deserve one. You better get one now because they're going fast." They'd almost always circle back and buy, sometimes waiting as long as 5 or 10 minutes to give themselves permission to have their very own up the wazoo t-shirt. The third customer was what I called the social proof buyer, which was the final 20% of the market. This customer would not buy unless there were others buying shirts. He or she would stand around watching the commotion and wait until there was a fray to jump into. We would get customers in waves, and when it got quiet, we would often have to identify the "you know what you want" buyers to gather around for a shirt, and then the social proof folks would follow suit. At one point, in all of this sales frenzy, I looked over at my young niece, Elsie, who somehow found herself in the middle of the commotion. She was holding a bouquet of $5 and $10 bills in her little hand. I was afraid some drunk would run by and swipe her money and hurt her in the process. So I quickly gathered up Elsie and her money and found a safe place with her next to Grandma, who was watching with a big smile from the curb. All in all, we sold roughly 450 shirts. We even had one raving fanatic who found us in a sweaty bar celebrating our success after it was all over, who bought the greasy shirt off my brother's back and then removed his own shirt and put that disgusting thing on. Ugh. That's brand evangelism for you, folks. A month later, my brother Mike and Chris took a bag of 30 or so shirts with them to a Cougar game in Pullman, Washington, and they were scooped up by tailgaters before they even got to the stadium. The word was out. We had arrived at not brand appreciation, but actually brand evangelism for our Up the Wazoo t-shirts. And then guess what happened? President Rollins got his shirt too. That November, I found myself on the campus of the University of Arizona, where the Cougs were taking on the Wildcats. I had 6 shirts left. I gave 5 of them to the WSU Booster Club for door prizes at their alumni gathering. Right then, President Rollins walked into the room. So I saddled over to him, introduced myself, and pulled from my bag the last XL and handed it to the tall drink of a man. I said, "This is a fitting end to my cause to gift you our last shirt, and it would be a tragedy to lose Wazoo." He was delighted. "You know," he commented, "we've made a lot of money on that logo." I grinned and said, "We have too. Thank you." I share this story with you from a blog that I had written many years ago, which I also sent to today's guest, Michael McQueen, author of Mindstuck. He said this story not only hilariously demonstrates scrappy entrepreneurialism, but it's a great example of how social proof and the momentum of crowd behavior can change everything.
That fear of loss is the big one that drives it. And the one that we've got to be very aware of is that loss of dignity. The sense that if I'm going to change my mind or change my view, I don't want to have to get to a position where I have to admit that I was an idiot in the process of doing so. And yet the reality is we so often do that. We give people no other leg to stand on than to say that I was wrong, I've now seen the light, you were right, and I've changed my view. And the reality is people's egos are resistant to that. And particularly some individuals, depending on temperament, style, or political affiliation, some people are more prone to going, I won't say I was wrong just because I don't want to tell you that you were right.
Michael McQueen is a multi-award-winning speaker, change strategist, and best-selling author of 10 books. He has spent the past 2 decades helping organizations and leaders win the battle for relevance, from Fortune 500 brands to government agencies to not-for-profits. Michael specializes in helping clients navigate disruption and stay one step ahead of change. Today, we'll explore why speaking to the mind matters. While it is tempting to opt for cold, hard facts and logic, the part of our brain that actually makes up our mind does not respond to these. It responds to emotional stories. We'll also look at why it's important to affirm and disarm to preserve the other's dignity in your discussion. You'll learn why it's important to separate people from their opinions and lead with vulnerability. And finally, don't be in it to win it. True persuasion happens when we start with a posture of openness and humility and prioritize the dignity and agency of those we are seeking to influence. So are you ready to build your influence and persuasive powers? Well, then you're in the right place. So let's now chat with Michael McQueen on the business of story. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Good to spend some time chatting.
Well, and you're a day ahead of us there in Sydney, Australia. So it's, and I know you just dropped your kids off at school or got them ready. So thank you for taking the time to be here with us. I found your book, Mindstuck, absolutely fascinating. And I first learned about you actually from my friend Paul Zak, who is in the social psychology persuasion world over in California. And he's been on the show a couple times. And
Fantastic.
I read a post on LinkedIn where he was sharing you and your work and your new book, and read through that. And I thought, man, I got to get him on the show. I hope he will say yes. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been interesting actually, that whole experience of you just sow seeds with the people you know, with the networks that you have established, and you never know who's reading, who's dialing in, and I love that. So often that's the way these things work, isn't it? So I'm glad that you know Paul, and that's a cool connection because he's doing some great research in a lot of the stuff that's adjacent to this book, and I really value not just the sort of the quality of the research he's doing, but just even the ethics, the heart that is behind it, which is sort of aligns with a lot of what I'm about as well.
Yeah. Well, you are a change strategist and you work with brands all around the world. Give us your backstory a little bit. How do you find yourself here? What were one or two or three moments in your life that you realized, man, I got to be a change strategist and write 10 books about it?
Well, firstly, I've been doing this for 20 years now. So I first started in 2004 in the research and conference speaking space. So those of you who are watching as opposed to listening can probably sort of figure out I'm not massively old. So I started off doing this when I was 22. And I did it basically because I had a passion for this sort of work. I loved reading good books, listening to great communicators. I thought, imagine if that could be a career. So I met some people who were in that full time as their career. I'm like, how do you do that? And so they gave me some great advice, which was find something you can really sink your roots down into and become the expert in. And I guess I had enough self-awareness as a 22-year-old that like you can't be an expert in too much when you're 22, just because you're 22 years of age. And so I thought, what if youth could be an asset rather than a liability, basically? So at the time, I was seeing, even within the workplace I was in post-college, I was working in a marketing role for a tech company. And I was seeing, even in that team, the friction between baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and I am a millennial. And I thought, this was in the news day after day, the sort of the friction points. I thought there's a lot going on here. That the gap to me was no one was speaking to young people about how to understand older generations, and it's got to be a two-way street. And so I basically left that role in the marketing function I was in, set out on my own, basically to do research and go into high schools and colleges to help young people understand the generation they were going to be working for in their first jobs in the next few years. All the stuff they don't teach you at school. And so that's where I started. So I did that for 3.5 years, had a team of presenters running programs around Australia and then beyond, and then worked with 80,000 young people. So quite a large sample size of what's actually happening in youth culture. Then I wrote my first book about millennials at that point, and then it all has sort of grown from there. So that's how long I've been doing this. I mean, the random backstory that goes before that. So I first wanted to become a speaker. How's this for a strange human vibe? When I was 8. I was not a normal child, evidently. So I was like my parents went to a work conference and the babysitter fell through. So my 4 brothers and I, the 5 of us had to drag along to this conference. And I listened to a speaker that day as an 8-year-old who was just the most superb communicator. And I was just transfixed and thought, how do you do that? So as always, that was the moment, that was the genesis moment of me wanting to do what I do. So yeah, it's been
now
quite
wait
a
a
long
minute.
journey
You were 8 years old. You were being
Correct.
babysat, and they took you to what could have very easily been a boring speaker. So what was the one thing from listening to that speaker that take us to that one moment when you felt it and you're like, yeah, that's what I want to do?
I wish I could remember that clearly. I remember the feeling more than the content that was shared. But what I do remember, so she was a speaker named Florence Littauer, and I believe she only passed away a few years ago at quite an advanced age, probably in her early to mid 90s, I think. So she'd been on the speaker circuit for decades, speaking about personality styles. And she was funny, she was well researched, and you'll love this. She was so narrative driven. Like everything she shared from the platform was stories about her life and her husband and poking fun at themselves and how different they were in their personality styles. And it was that moment where you could see a whole group of people suddenly go, oh, like I get myself in a way I've never understood before. And now I understand my kids and the people I'm working with. Like just seeing those light bulb moments and just seeing the craft of the delivery. And I do remember walking out of that room and saying to my parents, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And they were polite and said, oh yeah, okay, cool. Like you do when your 8-year-old says they want to be something like an astronaut or whatever. But it did stick.
So in your when you were early 20s, you said 22, you started seeing this divide between the different, baby boomers, which I am, and the millennials, Gen Xers, whatever. And you decided you were going to help start to pull those different mindsets, those different groups together to find common ground and to truly understand, appreciate, and empathize with everyone. I'm presuming because you were in marketing and you realize if you are going to sell stuff, then you better be influential and persuasive, and maybe most importantly, understanding.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I started certainly with trying to bring generations together. And then what happened in the next few years was I could see that generational change doesn't happen in isolation. The very things driving the divides between generations are changes in social attitudes, expectations. And then you're dipping into sociology. And then you look at what's happening with technology and how that is also driving what's often this sense of tribalism between generations. And then look at, from a tech perspective, how is the advancement or the march of tech, particularly in the last few years with AI, how is that potentially driving us further apart, not just as generations, but as tribes in society as well? And so the scope of my research has sort of broadened from just being demographic and generational to then it was societal trends, technology trends, business and disruption trends more broadly. And then the most recent book is a bit of a gear shift from where I've been, but it has sort of flowed out of a lot of that work. And so the genesis story behind Mindstuck as a body of research and trying to understand the psychology of stubbornness. This whole book basically came from one conversation in late 2015. I was speaking at an industry association conference and they'd given me the topic and the slot just before the lunch break, because it's often like low energy, like come in and rev them up, but also rev them up and scare them was the brief. So I was basically asked to come in and talk about what's happening in that particular industry in the next 3 to 5 years that they need to get ready for as operators, as businesses. So I was talking about AI, and at that point it was some of the stuff around synthetic reality, virtual reality, how that was going to change the customer engagement experience piece. So I'd speak a lot about where the world was heading. And at the end, I remember at the lunch break, a woman came up to me and I can still picture her. She was the image of frustration. And she said, I get it. I'm so with you. And everything you've just shared, like I can see in our industry and in my business in particular, if we don't change and change fast, we're going to be out the door in 5 or 6 years. We're going to be out of business. It'll be like a Kodak moment, basically. And she said, my challenge is I cannot get my leadership team on board with this. They just can't see it. Like I've tried so many different ways to help them realize that we need to change, but they're so rigid in their idea about how things should be done, how the industry should function or does function, even though it's very outdated. Their assumptions don't even work anymore, but that's their mindset. And so I said to her, what have you tried? And so she went through sort of the tactics she'd employed to try and get her leadership team over the line with changing their view. And she'd done all the right things, like all the things the books tell you. I try and change someone's mind, and it hadn't worked. And so I started to see this theme crop up consistently in the coming few months. Now that I was aware of it with conversations with clients, I'm like, what's that about? And so that was the moment where I thought I'm going to go deep and look at what's actually effective in getting through to stubborn people. Because I think a lot of the conventional wisdom we've inherited sounds right, seems intuitive, but it actually doesn't work. And so the harder you push, the less effective you become in trying to change people's minds. So this book was an attempt to actually look at what does work.
So you had obviously done a lot of this work and research and read lots and lots of books. You pull out all the major thinkers in this area, and you do a really nice job in Mindstuck of connecting the dots so we can read through there and take in this volume of information and research, and you take us, on this journey through, and your storytelling in it is really marvelous too, to make your points. One thing that struck me, and I've been through it twice now, it's this kind of discomfort that I have, and maybe we all have, we are trying to make a point that we believe in, right? And this is a ubiquitous we. And we really believe this point, but we honestly cannot do all the research to truly know if we are right or wrong, correct or incorrect. And yet we will hold firm to what we believe and to try and influence and persuade people to see the world our way, to do things the way we do it and buy into that. And it created some real cognitive dissonance for me. It's the first time I've ever read a book where I said, wait a second, Park, what you're professing here, 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 or your position on this, is it actually correct? And who says if it's correct
Yeah.
or not? How do you resolve that?
I think firstly, the fact that you're even asking that question and aware of that is half the battle. I think because what you often see, and you see this in so many social issues and areas, and then when politics and ideology gets involved, those who are the most shaky in their ideology often have the loudest voices. It's almost like you make up for that sense that I'm not quite sure about this, but don't you dare challenge me.
Right.
And they often become the most militant. And you see that people who are measured, thoughtful, deep thinkers have an appreciation for nuance. They have an appreciation that they've read deeply, they've thought widely about an issue, and that actually gives them a sense of humility that doesn't come when you've only got a very shallow sense of all the issues involved. And so I think firstly, just being aware that's in all of us, and I mean we all have it, like in different things. So I might be very knowledgeable and deep and researched in one area, but that doesn't carry across to every other area that's adjacent to that. So I have times where I've got to step back and go, okay, I could easily apply a very certain view because I think I've got a hunch about what I think about this and the way things should be done. But I have to step back and go, okay, but this is actually outside my wheelhouse. I might know a lot about other issues, but I don't know about this. So how do you adopt that posture of humility to be curious? I think curiosity is the most important trait for any of us right now, because curiosity puts you in that posture where you're open, you're asking questions. And I read recently, and I thought it was so profound. They said, smart people give good answers, wise people ask good questions. And I'm like, I love that, because that's my constant challenge to myself is how do I consistently, rather than rush to give an answer, go, okay, that's interesting, I'm actually not sure. Or ask questions to draw other people out. And I think the challenge is, and part of the work that you and I are in, I mean, the fact that we're on this podcast is often the sense that if you ask a question, there's an expectation I'm going to come up with an answer and it's going to be profound and simple and soundbitey and memeable. And that's what our world rewards. Like I did a TV interview yesterday afternoon on our national network news thing. And they don't want nuance. They don't want complexity. They want the soundbite and the certainty. This is the way the world is. And so we've got a society that tends to value that. And we expect our politicians to do the same thing, to be absolutely certain, not to be nuanced. The problem with that is it doesn't reflect reality. Humans and life is nuanced. And so when it comes to our own way of processing things and developing ideas, having that posture of humility, I think is incredibly helpful.
It's helpful, but it's hard. And let me explain that to you. Again, as I was reading your book, I was towards the beginning of it, and I had something go down where a loved one of mine, a family member of mine, attacked me on political views. And we weren't even talking politics. And in your book, and as I was getting attacked, it wasn't a conversation, it wasn't a dialogue, it was a diatribe aimed at me. And I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? And you had signaled out 3 points in your book up top that I thought was interesting: identity, ideology, and intuition.
Yeah.
Can you real quickly explain those 3 and then let me finish that little event that happened? Because I want to ask you, how would you have handled it?
Yes, that's interesting. So identity is all about essentially that who I am, what my beliefs are. And the reality is we'd like to think that seeing is believing, that we would, if we see something, we'll take it on board and accept that as a different data set or a data point that we hadn't considered before. The reality is our brains, and there's a lot of neuroscience that looks at this, our brains see what they want to see, essentially. We become very selective. So we've got to be very aware of that tendency in all of us and how that can actually lead us to denial. We can deny the facts just because those facts are inconvenient and uncomfortable. And so there's a lot of the book looks at the neuroscience of what's actually happening in our brains when it's not that we are unwilling to listen to different perspectives. Sometimes we're just actually unable to. It is so confronting neurologically to us. And so therefore, how do you then get around that if you're going to try and persuade someone? So identity is the first big one. The whole notion around of our tribe is important as well. Who do we belong to? Who is our group? And the truth is, most of us, when it comes to ideology, we will look at who others around us are following, what they are all saying, what they're all thinking as a proxy for us deciding how we feel about an issue. And so the first question people tend to ask when exposed to ideas is, what do people like me tend to think about things like this? And so there's a reason for that. There is safety in numbers. We all want to be part of a tribe. You don't want to hold a view that is at odds with your tribe because it's a very unsafe thing. And deep down intuitively, we know that. So that tribalism, the polarization that kicks off as a result of that it's a real thing. And we're seeing that in the social sphere day after day. The intuition piece is interesting because we often do defer to that gut feel of, does this feel right or not? And sometimes we need to listen to that because our intuition has a wisdom about it that we'd be naive to ignore entirely, but also to realize that when we're trying to persuade other people, if you're just hitting the logical points and all the rational reasons they should accept or even consider your perspective without acknowledging that there are other things that may mean that intuitively, deep down at a gut level, they can't accept that, often because they've got an imagined view of reality. And if their imagination is such a deeply emotion-driven thing, that the logic doesn't touch it. And yet we tend to use those tools of logic and wonder why we're getting nowhere.
So to continue that, because I found that particular part of the book very interesting and what I was up against, is this person brought up, and this was the second time it was brought up to me over the last couple of years. They would say, 5 years ago, you said blah, 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 blah. Do you really know what that means? And I'm going, well, number one, that was 5 years ago. I may have changed my view. And number two, I don't even remember saying that. And then they went on to educate me about their identity and ideology and so forth. Yep. And of course, they're coming from a very Republican point of view, which is fine. I got no problem with that. I was once a Republican, and then I was a Democrat, and then I registered as an independent, unbeknownst to them, and I couldn't get a word in edgewise, just kept attacking me. And then they, said, if the election was going to happen today, would you vote for Trump or for Biden? And my argument was, I don't really care for either one of them. In the leadership role, I would never vote for Donald Trump because I don't like him as a human being, so I guess I would have to go with Biden. And then he immediately jumps up, points at me. There, you see, he's a Democrat. I knew it. He's a Democrat. Wow. So he was labeling me, and I'm going, do you actually realize that I'm a registered independent? I vote both Democrat and Republican central down the aisle because I think there's good ideas on both sides of the aisle. Again, nuance.
Yep.
I guess I label myself then as an independent, but I'm much more, I believe, labeled myself as open-minded to who is the best leader out there, regardless of their party affiliation, that can build prosperity for all of us in health, in money, in family, in opportunity, because isn't that what we all really want? But Michael, I couldn't voice that at all because I would immediately get shut down with this singular label view. And I thought I was trying to use your tips from your books. And I finally ended up just saying, I don't know. What do you think about this? I don't know. What do you think about that? I don't know. And just had to basically resign that this was not a discussion.
Yeah, so what you asked questions in response, and there was an I don't know response from the other person.
No, they were asking them of me, and I couldn't get an answer out with being attacked before I was even finished with the answer. They were already defending their position against my answer, so I gave up, and I just simply said, I don't know.
So I think the best response in things like that, like whenever someone's dealing with very strong emotions, firstly you want to give credit where credit's due. So they're passionate. I mean, that's a good thing. You want people in society who are passionate about whatever they're passionate about. And so that's a great thing to be passionate about, but perhaps it's misdirected passion. So the good thing to start off with is acknowledging that and esteeming that and going, like, you seem so passionate about this, which is like, I love that you believe that you're serious about your beliefs. Like, what is that about? Like, where's that passion come from? Or why do you feel so strongly? And what's interesting is what you can then do is often get a sense of what's actually behind this. And then once they talk about the things that have led them to that very strong view, sometimes what you'll hear emerge, and not sometimes, often what you hear emerge is things that are just blatantly untrue. Well, the other side, if they had blah, 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 it would be, and you go, okay, cool. Like, I'd actually haven't considered that before. I've never come across that. Where did you read that, or where did you hear that? Like, even just drawing people out, because what's interesting is if you allow people to expand on their own ideology, eventually they wrap themselves up in knots. It becomes a mess. And so, which can be a really helpful process depending on how you respond to that. What you can't then do is jump in and go, see, you haven't thought it through. And like the moment you've backed them into a corner, of course, and they just shut straight back down again. But just genuinely being curious and asking questions of the other person, and then ideally showing how what you share in common is a real thing. Like the fact that, well, do you know what? The interesting thing is I actually want exactly the same stuff. I'm just as keen to see our national identity preserved, to see people in jobs that have dignity and that they get well paid for. I'm keen, like, you're actually wanting to arrive at the same point. And I think that's some of the challenges. Once you start labeling people and putting people into boxes, it's very easy to just dismiss entirely the other person as being two-dimensional without realizing they've got views and you've got views that are actually probably there's a lot of crossover. And if you can start where the crossover is, it's not going to solve everything, but it's far more likely to be a fruitful conversation. I think the other thing that's helpful in all this is going into those sort of very fractious conversations with a genuine willingness to listen. I think so often we want, and all of us, we want to get defensive because we feel like we're getting attacked by the other person. And sometimes just taking the time to stop and listen to the other person. When you ask those questions, genuinely take the time to listen. Oscar Trimboli, who's done some great research on listening, particularly deep listening. I remember reading something from him a little while back. He said, never overlook the fact that the words listen and silent are made up of the same letters. I'm like, that is so true and so profound and so easy to forget. Like, do we actually create space for the other person to talk it out? And one other last little tip that could be useful, and I learned this in fact from Paul Zach, was that if you're having a high stakes conversation, don't sit opposite the other person or even sit down. You know, if you can get out and go for a walk, something that happens neurologically when we're walking alongside someone, we get in step, we start to match their cadence. And neurologically, essentially, there's a sense of connection, a mind meld that is formed when you're matching someone and in sync with them. And you sometimes find those sort of very fractious conversations, best thing you can do, get out and do something side by side because it creates that sense of commonality that's so unconscious, but can just diffuse some of that tension.
Now, you had talked about there when they get very passionate about it, and we all do when we are, defending our position or trying to persuade someone over. Passion is so important. And early in the show, when I asked you about that speaker as an 8-year-old boy, what did you remember? I don't remember what she said, but I remember how I felt. That famous old line. So there it is again. And we often talk about in your storytelling, sell to the heart and the head will follow. Yep. You've got a really good example in your book as to why logic and reason doesn't work. Facts and figures do not really work very effectively over emotion when you're trying to persuade someone to see it your way. And you've got a terrific story in the water business talking about, very fractious environments of trying to get people to drink reclaimed, refiltered water versus fresh water directly from their toilet. So can you share that with us a little?
Yeah, so there's been a long history, in fact, of recycled, purified water. It's been happening in numerous parts of the world for decades. But what we've seen in some parts of the US, for instance, in the last 10, 15 years, has been a desire to try and recycle water. So in other words, turn wastewater into drinkable or potable water, particularly in places like San Diego, where most of their water is actually pumped from the Colorado River, goes through numerous fault lines. It's expensive to relocate. And so water independence is important for every community, every city. And so the officials in San Diego decided to try and experiment with recycling water. But the amount of pushback, like the stubbornness around that, partly because what was elicited was this response of disgust, whether people understood the science or not, whether they actually understood that recycled water is safer than what they can get out of a bottle at the store, for instance, or certainly out of their tap in their traditional way, that the science didn't matter. And so they tried to give all the science and the logic, and it had no impact because it was that intuition piece. It was that imagined reality of I'm drinking water that came from sewage. Now, if you step back from that for a moment, the truth is we are all drinking water that was at some point sewage. I mean, anyone who understands basic hydrology means water falls as rain, it gets consumed or flows through water systems out to the ocean, gets evaporated, then recycled. We're drinking the same water that's been on planet Earth for millennia. So in some ways, that's not new. So part of the case was trying to show that was what was going on. What they also found that was effective was actually indicating to people in San Diego this was already happening. So for instance, you pump water from the Colorado River. upstream of where the water that San Diego got out of the Colorado River came from, there are multiple places, communities that have used that water, recycled it, pumped it back into the river. So one of the things that was helpful to show that this is not actually new, and this is a really key insight when it comes to persuading anybody, is that we tend to think that humans are afraid of change, and they're not. Even though we thought that for years, humans are not afraid of change, they're afraid of loss. And so the losses you've got to deal with if you're trying to persuade someone to think differently are loss of certainty, a loss of dignity, or a loss of power. The moment those three things are threatened, that's when people get stubborn. And so in this case here, the first one was a loss of certainty. People are like, well, we know the water we've been drinking for years is reliable because I've never gotten sick from it, but you want to have recycled water, is that as safe? So then showing that actually this is not something that's different from what we've done for years, it's just a slightly different mechanism. That helped in trying to diffuse some of the skepticism. But over time, there are a whole lot of different things they did to try and address this. They opened up a facility we could go and experience what the process is of purifying the water. They also changed the language. They used to use language that was very academic, very scientific, potable reuse, for instance, like terms that mean nothing to the average person. And so even changing it to purified recycled water was just much more acceptable as language. So there were lots of techniques they used, and basically, if you look at the track over time of the willingness of people in San Diego to drink recycled water, it went from like double digits, low double digits, to well over half, close to 60% in the space of about 10 years. People are like, you know what? Yeah, I can see the sense in this. And they changed views fundamentally. And that's been played out now in numerous communities around the US and the world, in fact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've done a lot of work in water conservation over the years. When I was running my ad agency in Phoenix for 20 years called Park & Co., we launched a water conservation campaign in 1998, way back when, here in Phoenix. And it was kind of amazing. It was universally powerful in that it could connect with people across the country. And we only launched it right here, started in the city of Mesa, and then the entire state took it over. And then I realized that we could potentially license this campaign across the country, which we did, because back then we didn't have a lot of water conservation campaigns going on. And we ended up licensing it to 400 private and public entities that ran the Water Use It Wisely campaign for many, many years. And in fact, it is still running in the state today. We found the same thing. We were dealing with a lot of water professionals, and they would use these big hydrology speak and potable water and whatever. And we would look there and go, we're pretty smart people, but we don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Yep.
And it took us to be able to simplify that and speak to it in residential homeowner terms. And so we had a little placard. We had prompts everywhere, and the idea was just to be thinking about water conservation. The whole tagline was, there are a number of ways to save water, but they all start with you. If you don't do it, the rest of it doesn't matter. And we had phenomenal success with it. So that particular story in your book really connected with me because of all the work we've done in the water world. And yet, when we were doing it, we would get pushback from lots and lots of groups, on why we were doing it. And they would argue our points, and you're a far left liberal here again. You get the labeling of it, and you're saying, no, we're all in this together. We want to preserve our environment. Why does fear and tribalism play such an overhanded, heavy role in communication and trying to connect common ground with people?
Well, I think there's certainly that fear of loss is the big one that drives it. And the one that we've got to be very aware of is that loss of dignity. The sense that if I'm going to change my mind or change my view, I don't want to have to get to a position where I have to admit that I was an idiot in the process of doing so. And yet the reality is we so often do that. We give people no other leg to stand on than to say that I was wrong, I've now seen the light, you were right, and I've changed my view. And the reality is people's egos are resistant to that. And particularly some individuals, depending on temperament, style, or political affiliation, some people are more prone to going, I won't say I was wrong just because I don't want to tell you that you were right. And we see that so often play out. So how do you give people that ability, the space, the permission, the safety to change their mind without feeling their dignity or their agency has been infringed upon? And so I think that's part of the first key, is the fear that comes when it comes into play when we're having to change our mind, is the fear that Firstly, we might have to admit we're an idiot and that we're not in charge of the process. So I think giving people choices. So let's say it might be guided choices. If you want to get someone to do something, give them 2 or 3 choices. They get to make a choice, but the reality is all the choices lead them to where you're hoping they'll go, but they feel like they were in control. They feel like it was their idea. And these are simple things we do with our kids at home. And yet there's a reason it works. Sheena Iyengar, who's done some great research at Columbia around this stuff, says that the human brain equates choice with control. The moment we don't feel like we've got a choice, we will dig our heels in, even if we know that what's being asked of us is something that deep down we know will be a good idea. So we've got to be very mindful of that sense of losing dignity or losing control in the process. The other thing I often refer to is this notion of psychological sunk cost. We know the economic sunk cost means, you'll stick with an idea, or you'll stick with a product or an initiative, even though it's not working out, and it's not going to work out most likely, and a better option has come along, but you've spent so much money and so much time, you'll see it through to the bitter end, and your past choices essentially rob you of future benefit. And the same thing happens psychologically. We'll have mindsets and beliefs and ways of doing things that we've invested so much time and energy in over the years that even though something better has come along, we'll stick with the original one because we've already spent so much of ourselves and invested, particularly if we've invested our ego, because we've become advocates for a particular viewpoint or way of doing things. And so even though deep down we know there's a better option and that we would benefit, in fact, from changing, unless you can change your mind without feeling like your dignity has been infringed on, you'll resist it and you'll go back to the thing that is safe, the thing that you've invested time and energy in. That's where psychological sunk cost also comes in.
What struck me about reading your book and then trying to apply some of this stuff, or when I was under fire and none of this stuff works, I don't know what to do next. It seems like it takes practice. Is there a way to effectively practice many of these skills that you talk about? And if so, what would be the number one place to start in that practice?
Yeah, great. I think the first thing is we go right back to the original masters of persuasion and influence. So Aristotle, the art of rhetoric was his whole concept of these 3 foundations for persuading someone else. That's a good place to start. So logos, ethos, and pathos. And we're pretty good at pathos, generally speaking, and I think so much of narrative is about speaking to the emotion, and pathos is a big part of that. Logos we're relatively good at, but it's the ethos bit that I think most of us need to practice a whole lot more.
Can you define those 3 for us?
Yeah, so logos is about essentially appealing to the logical faculties. Pathos is the heart. Ethos, though, is the middle one. And I think it's the one that it's about trust and credibility. How do you build affinity and trust with the people you're trying to persuade? And I feel like if there's one thing we can all practice and get really good at, it's that. And because once you've got a foundation of trust, it's almost like that. It doesn't really matter which tip or technique you use or how well you use it. Once there's high trust, that's a foundation you can build on fairly safely. And I think so. There's a lot of great research around how do you build trust and affinity with the people you're trying to persuade. One of the key things is unsell your ideas rather than upselling them. Rather than trying to give all the benefits, all the reasons why your view is right and their view is wrong, just dial it back a bit and go, you know what? Preface things with, hey, I might be way off here, or I might be wrong, or I'm just toying with this idea. I'm keen to get your input, and approaching it with that sense of openness and curiosity invites the other person in, rather than you going in with your very clear idea that you've rehearsed and you've got right down pat, and this is the way things should be. Now you're trying to get them on board because, of course, the first thing they will do is dig their heels in. This is a key tool of building ethos. Another really powerful ethos tool is self-deprecation and self-disclosure. So, in fact, there's some great research I share in the book from Kip Williams, who's done some work looking in legal cases or legal contexts. What's the point where a jury begins to favor one side or another in a legal setting? And what he found is that typically it's because one of the lawyers brought to the table and shared with the jury details, evidence, information that might actually work against their own case. They were upfront about the fact that it's not just black and white, there are shades of grey here. The key was you had to bring that to the table before the opposing side had the chance to. But in doing so, what it signaled to the jury was that you were open-minded, you were fair-minded, you were objective, and it built trust. And what it did is it also disarmed them, because you think about it, if you're speaking to someone and only sharing all the good reasons why what you're suggesting is bang on and correct, what's the other person doing? They're in their mind thinking, what are the loopholes? What are the things you're not telling me? What's the counter view to this? The moment you actually you lead with that and you say, you know what, there are areas of grey here. I've not figured the whole thing out, but my sense is that this is something we should consider. It disarms that in the other person. So these are simple texts for building affinity and that sense of ethos that they're simple, but they can make all the difference. Another tip that could be helpful for people listening in, and I deliberately created this because of the issue you've mentioned there, because the book is shockers. It's full of different techniques and tips and ideas and studies. And I deliberately wanted to put a lot in there and order it in a way that was easy to reference, but there is still a lot in there. So what we created was actually an AI bot that is built using OpenAI's platform to do this. And it's a closed system, so it's not like an open large language model. So what you put in there is just stays within the bot. But what you can do is you can actually ask it a question. Like, let's say you've got a situation with a colleague at work, I've got this colleague, this is going on, what should I do? Or in the case of that family member who was pushing back, you could actually describe that as a question. The bot will scan the book, scan the entire manuscript of Mindstuck and come back with some coaching and advice, like bullet point, try this, say this, use this technique, use this approach. And it's amazing. The AI is incredibly clever, very intuitive. So if people want to give that a try, because it's a good way of just having a little bit of a little coach for how to persuade people, it's mindstuck.ai is where that lives. And so you can go in and ask it questions. It'll give you coaching and advice.
Mindstuck.ai. I'm writing that down. I'll certainly put that in the show notes. That's fantastic. I didn't know you had that. Is that covered in the book somewhere?
No, that happened since the book. Well, the reality is the AI stuff's moving so fast. So when we released the book, these things weren't even possible. Like to build a large language model or one of these bots was so difficult. And in fact, we built this before OpenAI made it really easy, where you can actually create your own chat bot fairly fast. So I'm
working on that right now with both our ABT narrative framework and our 10-step story cycle system, so that people have a tool that they could go in and simply do exactly what you're talking about. They're trying to create a brand story strategy, per the 10-step process. Here's, the next steps, and they can put in their own information. We'll be able to scan their website and understand how they're already talking about the company, and then say, okay, now to really fine tune this, here's what I'd recommend. And we're just beginning that. I might have to call you and pick your brain a little bit on that, Michael.
Yeah, it's a really powerful technology if you use it well.
Yeah, that's very cool. All right, final quick topic. I started the show by sharing with our listeners the article that I shared with you, and I had not thought about that whole situation. This was the selling of the "I'm tired of political correct" or "I've had political correctness up the wazoo" T-shirts. Back in 2002. But so many of your points in this book, I started thinking about that dynamic, because at the time when we were selling the shirts, I was just trying to sell shirts. After the fact, I look back, I go, well, that was interesting when that happened, and that happened. I started seeing this trending in this social behavior, so I couldn't help but send that article to you prior to the show, because I think it did underscore a number of the points in your book.
Yeah. Well, I think it speaks to tribalism, that need for us to belong. People want to feel like they've got something that they have in common with others. And so the T-shirt spoke to that. There was also that sense of we're pushing back against this idea of, there's nothing that binds people together like a common enemy. And so you have to use that carefully, because that can become a very divisive thing, but it can be a great unifying tool, even if the enemy is mediocrity. If you're leading a team, you're like, our enemy is becoming irrelevant or just doing an okay job. We want to do an excellent job. And so you can unite behind a common enemy. So it tapped into that beautifully. But the great thing, of course, was the moment you had that social pressure or social proof. Once people saw in the arena others were wearing the shirt, it's like, well, if everyone else is wearing this shirt, I want one too. And I've seen that play out so many times. And I wrote about this a number of times in the book, this notion of how do you use social proof, those herd instincts, in a helpful way, because they're incredibly powerful. And I think the best example I came across, and I shared it in the book, was years ago I had a book launch, and it was a bit of an unusual one. So the publishers actually lined up, as part of the PR tour and the media tour, a segment on the Home Shopping Network. And I'm like, wow, I like home shopping has always been one of those things that whenever I'll
Home Shopping Network to sell a book? I've never heard of that.
Yes, I know. I hadn't either. It was pretty strange, because the stuff they sell always makes me laugh. The sort of the exercise equipment or the whatever. Whenever I flip past, I'll sometimes watch just to have a bit of a laugh. So I guess I had quite a judgy, dim view of home shopping as a business model. And then I turn up at this place in Florida, their studios where they were recording, and I was stunned at how scientific how strategic this whole business model is and how lucrative it is. My goodness, they make some money. But I was watching the scripting they were using as I was on set doing the segment, watching the hosts and the scripting. They had the little earpiece in, getting coaching from the producer back of house. And like, it was so down to minute word choice and language choice. And so I was chatting with a producer afterwards about how they come up with the scripts they use and how they test different things. And a few years ago, one of the big learnings they had in the home shopping world was the way they phrased the call to action made all the difference. So for years, the call to action after they talked about the product and the features and the benefits and 5 easy payments of whatever, plus postage and handling, always postage and handling. Once they talked about that, then it was the call to action, call now, operators are standing by. And they'd use that as their standard call to action for years. And then they started to tweak that and trial a few different calls to action. The one that they struck upon that caused a massive jump in the number of callers, because that's all you had at the time. This is sort of really pre-internet days in a way. That was the language they used, which is high, call volumes are high. If operators are busy, please try again later. Now, at face value, you would think that would be a discouragement to ring, because they're like, well, if I try and call, they're going to be busy. I'll have to wait. I might not even get through. But what it signaled is everyone else is calling, so you better as well. And that whole social proof thing, it worked an absolute treat. And we'd like to think as humans, we're really individual, really independent. We don't run with the herd, but we do. We're so instinctively driven to look at what others are doing as cues for what we should do. And so when that comes to persuasion, that can make a huge difference if we use that tool well and ethically.
Yeah, so very, very interesting. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. Absolutely love it. Where can people learn more about you and find your book?
Yeah, probably the best place would be michaelmcqueen.net. There's sort of everything for me lives there, resources, articles, video posts, and there's sections for the book there. And that book bot, again, if you want to try that out to use the AI one, so mindstuck.ai would be a good place to go to. In terms of socials, LinkedIn. I spend most of my time in terms of social posting on LinkedIn. So I'm sharing content 2 and 3 times a day of just what I'm seeing, case studies, examples, data. So if you want to connect, LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me.
That's great. I can't wait to try that Mindstuck.ai. I wished I had that about 2 weeks ago. I would have to say, one second, let me go to the restroom. I'll be right back. I'd jump in on my phone. I'd pull it up. I go, how in the hell do I deal with this mess? And then I'd come out. I'd be completely pulled together. I'd have my argument down. It wouldn't be an argument. It would be a dialogue. And I could persuade and influence and get them to see it my way. And when we're all said and done, they would say, wow, I was really enjoyed this conversation with you, Park. But that's not the way it happened.
Oh, dear. Well, it's been lovely to chat. And I'm so glad you found the book valuable. That means a lot. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Michael.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you like what you heard and you know of anyone else who would benefit by becoming unmindstuck, to become more influential and persuasive in their storytelling, in their discussions, in their debates, well, share this episode with them. If I can help you and your team excel through the stories you tell, then please reach out to me at park@businessofstory.com. I've got in-person master classes. I've got mastery courses. I've got virtual training. I've got, of course, the online training, the very popular ABTs of Agile Communications. Check that out at businessofstory.com/ABT. And if I can help you, just shoot me a note, park@businessofstory.com. I'd like to give a big shout out to Darius Holbert, who composed all of our custom music, to Caden Howell, who does such a wonderful job editing this show, and for Marissa Hill, who helps me share it with our world through our marketing and community development. I hope you'll join us next Monday when we are going to have an extraordinary brand storyteller for you by the name of Kathy Guzman Galloway. You're not going to want to miss it. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one sensational. Thanks so much for listening.